Rich widow bought a giant mountain man at auction, and what he did next shocked the entire West. That's what folks still whisper. She raised her parasol and bought a man twice her size and full of silence, straight out of shackles. Nobody knew why. They just watched him ride off with her, toward a ranch full of secrets and a valley the railroad aimed to swallow. He said nothing, but the land remembers. And when the wind changes and the bell rings, blood, mercy, and fire will decide who gets to stay. What did she see in him, and why are the powerful so desperate to stop it? Your reactions reaffirm something simple, yet powerful, that stories still shape us, even in silence. If you believe in the soft endurance of love, truth, and doing what's right, then you're exactly why these stories exist. The summer sun blazed overhead as townsfolk gathered around the weathered courthouse steps in Calico Ridge. Dust swirled in the hot Colorado breeze, coating boots and skirt hems as people shuffled closer, drawn by morbid curiosity to the day's penal auction. The crowd parted like water around stones as two deputies led forward a giant of a man in iron shackles. Cord Gideon's dark eyes burned with barely contained fury beneath the brim of his worn cavalry hat. His massive shoulders remained squared despite the weight of the chains, and his jaw was set in a hard line above his untrimmed beard. Whispers rippled through the onlookers as Sheriff Morton read out the terms of indenture. "Ain't that the scout who led them massacres up north?" A voice hissed. "Heard he turned on his own men," another answered. "Mutiny, they say." Women clutched their shawls tighter and stepped back, though the summer heat warranted no such covering. Even the men, for all their bold talk, kept their distance from the platform where Gideon stood like a caged mountain lion. Sheriff Morton's voice carried across the courthouse square. "Bidding starts at $100 for 3 years' labor. Do I hear 100? Silence fell heavy as iron. The townsfolk traded uneasy glances, but no hands raised. Even at such a bargain, none dared risk housing a man with Gideon's reputation. The clip-clop of horse hooves drew all eyes to the street where a black surrey rolled to a stop. A woman in an elegant riding habit of dark wool descended with quiet grace, her silver hair neat beneath a modest black hat. Eleanor Harrow made her way through the parting crowd with the dignity of a queen, though her expression held nothing but calm purpose. $500, she announced clearly, her voice carrying across the sudden hush. Sheriff Morton's eyebrows shot up. "Mrs. Harrow, surely you don't mean to—" "I believe that exceeds your minimum bid, Sheriff." Eleanor's tone was polite, but firm, as she withdrew a bank draft from her reticule. "I trust the paperwork is ready." Gideon's sneer cut through the shocked silence. "Save your money, widow. I ain't worth the trouble you're buying." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "The worth of a soul isn't measured in dollars, Mr. Gideon." She turned back to the sheriff. "The papers, if you please." Morton scrambled to produce the documents while mutters of concern rippled through the crowd. Eleanor's pen scratched steadily across the pages, her hand never wavering. When she finished, she faced the deputies. "Remove his chains," she ordered quietly. "Ma'am, we can't recommend—" one deputy began. "I didn't ask for recommendations." Eleanor's voice remained gentle, but brooked no argument. "I've purchased this man's labor, not his bondage. Remove the chains." The iron links clattered against the wooden platform as the shackles fell away. Gideon rubbed his wrists, his expression unreadable as he studied the diminutive woman before him. "Why?" The word scraped from his throat like rusty nails. Eleanor adjusted her gloves with precise movements. "For mercy's sake, Mr. Gideon, not vengeance." She gestured to the surrey. "Shall we? There's work waiting at the ranch, and we're losing daylight." The crowd watched in stunned silence as the massive ex-scout followed the widow to her waiting carriage. He paused at the step, then wordlessly offered his hand to help her up. Eleanor accepted it with simple dignity, as though such courtesy from a former prisoner was nothing extraordinary. As the surrey rolled away from Calico Ridge, the setting sun painted the sky in sheets of gold and purple. Dust from the wheels caught the fading light like glittering clouds. Neither passenger spoke as the town fell away behind them, but the silence between them hummed with unasked questions. Eleanor kept her eyes on the road ahead, handling the reins with quiet competence. Gideon sat rigid beside her, his shoulders tense as though expecting a blow. The only sounds were the steady clip of hooves and the creak of leather harness as they made their way toward the distant hills where Eleanor's ranch lay waiting. The widow had shocked them all today, the town, the law, and most of all the broken man beside her. As darkness crept across the land, that surprise hung between them like an unspoken prayer, a fragile hope that mercy might prove stronger than the weight of the past. The Surrey crested the final hill as night settled over the Colorado highlands. Moonlight silvered the scattered pines and caught the weathered sides of Eleanor's ranch buildings below. The main house stood solid and square-built, its windows dark. Beside it, a barn leaned slightly with age, its paint faded by countless seasons. A dry creek bed snaked past both structures, its dusty course visible even in the dim light. Eleanor drew the horses to a halt in the yard. "Welcome to Mercy Ridge," she said, her voice carrying in the evening quiet. "It's not much, but it's home." Cord remained silent as he helped her down from the surrey, his large hands careful but impersonal. His eyes swept the property with the practiced gaze of a scout, noting the defensive positions, the water situation, the lay of the land. The foothills rose dark behind the ranch, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. "The bunkhouse is this way," Eleanor said, lifting a lantern from the surrey. Its light bobbed like an earthbound star as she led him to a small building set apart from the main house. "It's basic, but clean. You'll have it to yourself." Inside, she lit a wall-mounted lamp, illuminating a simple room with 2 narrow beds, a washstand, and a pot-bellied stove. Cord ducked his head to enter, his massive frame making the space seem smaller. "You must be hungry," Eleanor continued, unfazed by his silence. "Come to the kitchen when you've settled in. I'll warm up some stew." 20 minutes later, they sat at Eleanor's worn kitchen table, lamplight casting warm shadows on the plank walls. Steam rose from their bowls, carrying the rich scent of beef and vegetables. Cord ate mechanically, his spoon moving with quiet precision, while Eleanor stirred her own portion with thoughtful care. "We'll talk about the work tomorrow," she said finally. "For now, rest." Cord's only response was a grunt as he finished his meal and withdrew into the night. Morning arrived with the cry of meadowlarks and the pale light of dawn. Eleanor was already at her kitchen table when Cord appeared, his face freshly washed, but his expression as guarded as ever. She gestured to the coffee pot on the stove and waited until he'd poured himself a cup before speaking. "I imagine you're wondering why I bought your contract," she began, her hands folded calmly before her. "Figured you needed ranch work done," he rumbled, his voice rough from disuse. Eleanor shook her head. "No, Mr. Gideon. I have a different purpose in mind." She drew a rolled paper from beside her and spread it on the table. "This is a plan for a schoolhouse. 1 room, solid construction, with windows and a proper slate board." Cord's dark brows drew together as he studied the simple drawing. "A school? Out here?" "Yes." Eleanor's voice took on a quiet intensity. "A school for both white and Apache children. There's a spot near the tribal border just past the old trading post. The land is already purchased." Cord's coffee cup hit the table with a sharp crack. "That's Apache territory. Nobody in their right mind would—" "The tribal council has already approved it," Eleanor cut in. "What we need now is someone to build it." "I ain't a teacher," Cord growled, "and I sure ain't a builder." Eleanor met his glare steadily. "You're not what you were. That's why you're here." The words hung in the air between them. Cord pushed back from the table and paced to the window, his shoulders tight with tension. Outside, the morning sun caught the dry creek bed, making the stones gleam like old bones. 1 week, he said finally, still facing the window. "I'll stay 1 week. After that, we'll see." Eleanor nodded, though he couldn't see it. She rose and crossed to a shelf, returning with a small leather-bound volume. "This was my husband's field Bible," she said, placing it on the table. "He carried it through the war, found comfort in its pages. Consider it a welcome gift." Cord turned, his expression conflicted as he looked at the worn book. After a long moment, he picked it up, his large hands almost engulfing the small volume. "Much obliged," he muttered, tucking it into his shirt pocket. Eleanor watched him, noting how his fingers lingered on the leather binding. Perhaps he felt it too, the weight of possibility, the chance to build something instead of destroying. She'd seen enough broken men in her life to recognize when one was ready to change, even if he didn't know it himself. "Breakfast in half an hour," she said simply. "Then we can look at those building plans in detail." The next morning broke clear and cool. Cord stood before a sprawling pile of old lumber behind the barn, methodically sorting planks by size and condition. His movements were precise, each board carefully examined and stacked. The discipline of his cavalry days showed in the ordered rows that grew under his careful attention. Eleanor watched from her garden, noting how his huge hands moved with surprising gentleness over the weathered wood. She pulled another weed from around her struggling tomato plants and added it to a basket. The dry spell had been hard on the vegetables, but she had hope for the late summer crop. Inside her study, Eleanor spent the afternoon at her writing desk, crafting careful letters. Her pen scratched steadily across the paper as she outlined her vision for the school to various Denver churches and Quaker mission boards. Each envelope she addressed represented another chance for support: books, supplies, or funds that could help bring her dream to life. "Dear Reverend Thompson," she wrote, "I write to you regarding an opportunity to bridge the divide between our communities through education." The stack of sealed letters grew as the afternoon light shifted across her desk. The sun was lowering towards the hills when hoofbeats sounded in the yard. Eleanor looked up from her writing to see a young Apache woman dismounting from a paint horse. She moved with natural grace, her long dark hair caught back in a simple braid. A leather satchel hung at her hip. Eleanor went to meet her on the porch. "Welcome to Mercy Ridge. I'm Eleanor Harrow." "I am Naline," the young woman replied in clear English. "Pastor Matthews at the agency sent me. I have his letter." She reached into her satchel and produced an envelope. Eleanor read the recommendation carefully. "You've been teaching at the agency school?" "Yes, 2 years now." Naline's voice held quiet pride. "I can teach in both English and Apache. The children respond well to having someone who knows both worlds." The sound of boots on gravel made them both turn. Cord had emerged from behind the barn, drawn by the conversation. He froze mid-step when he saw Naline. The change that came over the young woman was instant and profound. Her spine stiffened, her chin lifted, and her eyes grew hard as stone. "You," she said, the single word sharp as a blade. Cord's face had gone pale beneath his tan. His hands clenched at his sides, then deliberately relaxed. "Miss Naline," he managed, his voice rough. Eleanor looked between them, reading volumes in their rigid postures. "You know each other?" "He knows my village," Naline said coldly, or what remained of it after his unit came through. Cord's jaw worked, but he said nothing. The weight of unspoken history hung heavy in the evening air. Eleanor drew a steady breath. "Please, both of you, come inside. We should talk about this over supper." The kitchen felt too small for the tension it now contained. Eleanor served a simple meal of beans and cornbread, the plates clicking too loudly on the worn table. Naline sat straight-backed in her chair, her food untouched. Cord hunched over his plate, his shoulders bearing an invisible weight. "I understand there is pain between you," Eleanor said finally, her voice gentle but firm. "But this school, it's meant to be a place of new beginnings. For the children's sake, we must find a way forward." "The children!" Naline's voice was bitter. "Like the children from my village?" Cord's spoon clattered against his plate. "I didn't," he started, then stopped. We had orders, but I couldn't. That's why I left, deserted. His words came out jagged, like stones dislodged from a long sealed wall. Eleanor folded her hands on the table. The past cannot be undone, but perhaps it can be redeemed. This school could be a step toward healing old wounds if we're brave enough to try. Naline's fingers traced the edge of her plate. The children need education. They need to learn both ways, to be strong in both worlds. She lifted her eyes to Cord's face. But trust must be earned. Cord nodded once, sharply. Yes, ma'am, it must. Then we begin there, Eleanor said, with that understanding. She rose and began clearing the plates, her movements deliberately normal in the charged atmosphere. Naline, I've prepared the spare room in the main house for you. Mr. Gideon will continue his work on the building site. We all have our tasks ahead of us. Through the kitchen window, the setting sun painted the dry creek bed in shades of gold and shadow. Eleanor watched as Naline walked to the porch to retrieve her saddlebags, her steps measured and proud. Cord returned to the lumber pile, his broad back bent as if under an invisible burden. It wasn't peace, not yet. But it was a beginning. The rain started that evening, drumming against the tin roof of Eleanor's house with growing intensity. By morning, the yard had turned to mud, and dark clouds promised more to come. Eleanor insisted both Cord and Naline stay in the main house until the weather cleared. The first day passed in awkward silence. Eleanor busied herself with mending and letter writing, while Cord claimed a corner of the sitting room, working with a small knife and pieces of pine wood. Naline kept to her room, emerging only for meals where the sound of forks on plates barely rose above the steady pour of rain outside. On the second morning, Eleanor uncovered the old upright piano that stood against the parlor wall. Her fingers, though stiffened by age, found their way across the yellowed keys. The instrument was badly out of tune, but the familiar hymns still rang true enough. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. She sang softly, her voice carrying through the house. The music seemed to ease some of the tension, like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. Cord sat in his corner, whittling what looked like a small horse from a piece of pine. Wood shavings collected at his feet as his big hands moved with surprising delicacy. Every so often, his eyes would drift to where Naline sat by the window, her back straight as she worked on lesson plans in a leather-bound notebook. The afternoon light had grown dim when Naline finally spoke, her voice cutting through Eleanor's gentle playing. I remember your face, she said, turning to Cord. From that night, I remember my brother's screams when the soldiers came. Eleanor's hand stilled on the piano keys. Cord's knife stopped moving, suspended above the half-carved horse. Your brother, Cord said roughly. Was he? He lived. Naline's words were sharp as flint. But others did not. Children. Elders. Our winter stores burned. Why did you come to our village? We had done nothing. Cord set down his knife and wood, his movements careful and deliberate. The commander said there were raiders hiding there. But when we arrived, I saw no warriors, just families. His voice grew hoarse. I refused to fire, tried to stop others, but it wasn't enough. No, Naline agreed, her eyes hard. It was not enough. Rain pelted against the windows as silence stretched between them. Eleanor remained at the piano, her presence steady as an anchor in troubled waters. That's why I deserted, Cord continued finally. Couldn't stomach being part of such things anymore. Spent 3 years in military prison for it. He met Naline's gaze. Not asking forgiveness, just telling you truth. Naline studied him for a long moment. I cannot forgive what happened, she said at last. But if you keep your word about building this school, I will stay. The children need this place. I'll keep my word, Cord replied simply. Eleanor's fingers found the piano keys again, this time playing Sweet Hour of Prayer in quiet, measured notes. The rain finally cleared on the third morning. The sun broke through the clouds, turning puddles to mirrors in the muddy yard. After breakfast, Cord brought out shovels and marking stakes for the school's foundation. They worked together in the cool morning air. Cord drove the stakes into the soft ground, measuring careful distances. Naliné helped him stretch twine between the markers, creating straight lines where the walls would stand. Eleanor brought them water in tin cups, watching with quiet satisfaction as the school's outline took shape on her land. The soil was heavy with moisture, making the digging easier than it might have been. Cord's shovel bit deep into the earth, carving out the first post hole. Without a word, Naliné took up the second shovel and began working on another corner. They dug in silence, but it was different now, focused rather than hostile. Eleanor stood at the edge of their work site, her grey hair catching the morning light. "Thank you both," she said softly. Opening her worn Bible, she read from Psalm 27. "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" The words floated on the morning air as Cord and Naliné continued their work, each post hole bringing them closer to something new. Not peace, exactly, but possibility. Their shadows fell side by side across the damp earth as they dug, and overhead, the clouds continued to clear. The morning sun climbed high as Eleanor hitched her bay mare to the wagon. The schoolhouse walls were taking shape, with Cord and Naliné working steadily to raise the rough-hewn timber frame. Eleanor watched them for a moment, noting how they moved with careful precision around each other, like dancers keeping their distance. "I'll fetch those window panes and nails from Calico Ridge," she called out, gathering her reins. "Should be back before supper." The drive into town took nearly 2 hours, the wagon wheels clattering over sun-baked ruts. Eleanor's thoughts drifted to her late husband James as she traveled. He would have loved seeing this school built, she mused, remembering his passion for education during their mission work. Calico Ridge had grown since her last visit. New storefronts lined the main street, their fresh-painted signs advertising dry goods and mining supplies. The railroad survey stakes dotted the landscape like wooden soldiers standing at attention. Eleanor had just finished loading supplies at Miller's General Store when a shadow fell across the wagon. Judge Varner Haskell stood there, cutting an imposing figure in his black broadcloth suit and string tie. Though he carried a Bible like a proper churchman, his eyes held the cold calculation of a businessman. "Mrs. Harrow," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Might I have a word?" Eleanor straightened her spine, noting the cluster of railroad men lingering nearby. "Of course, Judge Haskell." "I have here," he said, producing a leather folio, "federal claims for the Denver and Rio Grande extension. The rail line will cut through both your property and the reservation allotment where you're building." "That land was deeded fair and square," Eleanor replied, her voice firm but calm. "My husband purchased it from the Territory Office 15 years ago. The school site is on my property, well within the legal boundaries." Haskell's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Progress doesn't always follow old boundary lines, Mrs. Harrow. The railroad means prosperity for everyone. Surely you can see that building a school there now would be premature." "The only thing I see, Judge, is that those children need education more than they need another railroad." Eleanor gathered her reins. "Good day to you, sir." "Consider carefully, madam," Haskell called after her. "The future's coming, whether you welcome it or not." The sun was lowering toward the mountains when Eleanor's wagon finally crested the last hill toward home. She pulled up short at the site before her. 5 children sat in a half-circle on the grass near the partially built walls, while Naliné stood before them with a slate board. 2 + 3 makes... Naliné pointed to the numbers she'd drawn. 5, the children called out together. 2 were settler children from nearby homesteads, their pale faces sunburned from farm work. The other 3 were Apache children, their dark eyes bright with interest. All 5 watched Naliné with equal attention as she drew more figures on the slate. Cord stood in the shadow of the rising walls, hammer paused mid-swing. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes never left the impromptu class. Eleanor wondered if he was seeing the future they were building, or remembering the past they were trying to heal. Later that evening, after the children had gone home and supper dishes were cleared away, Eleanor shared Haskell's threat. The three of them sat around the kitchen table, the lamp casting long shadows on the walls. "Railroad claims," Cord muttered, his face darkening. "I knew some of Haskell's men during the war. They worked as land agents back then, too." He looked up, meeting Eleanor's eyes. "There's bodies buried under those claims, Mom. Men who wouldn't sell, Indians who wouldn't move. Accidents, they called them." Naline's hands tightened around her cup. "The agent at White Mountain spoke of railroad men coming. Said they promised jobs, but my people remember broken promises." "Well, they won't find me easy to move," Eleanor said firmly. "This land was James's dream, a place where people could come together, learn from each other. I won't let them bury that dream under their iron rails." The lamp flickered, making their shadows dance on the walls. Outside, a coyote called lonely into the gathering dark, and somewhere in the distance, an owl answered. The night sounds of the frontier floated through the open window, reminding them of how much space still remained in this vast land. Space enough, surely, for both progress and mercy, if men's hearts were big enough to hold both. Cord stood, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "Best get some rest. Those walls won't raise themselves come morning." Naline nodded, rising as well. "And the children will return. They are hungry to learn." Eleanor watched them go, these two unlikely allies in her cause. She offered up a silent prayer of thanks, even as she wondered what challenges tomorrow would bring. The railroad was coming, yes, but tonight they had their purpose, their place, and each other. The schoolhouse walls rose steadily against the summer sky. Cord's skilled hands guided each beam into place, while Naline sorted through her collection of teaching materials. Smooth stones for counting, dried plants for learning names, and wooden cards she'd carved with both English letters and Apache symbols. "These markings," she explained to three wide-eyed children seated on a log, "tell the story of how Coyote brought fire to the people." Her fingers traced the carved symbols while she translated the tale into simple English. Cord paused his hammering to listen, his expression softening as she described Coyote's clever tricks. Eleanor watched from her garden, noting how naturally Naline wove traditional teachings into her lessons. The young teacher had a gift for holding children's attention, whether she was teaching numbers or sharing stories about the plants that grew wild in the hills. Later that afternoon, the mail stage brought welcome news, a letter from the Denver Quaker Mission Society. Eleanor's eyes brightened as she read aloud. "We are pleased to support your endeavor with a shipment of 30 hymnals and 1 classroom chalkboard due to arrive next week." "That's fine news," Cord said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Proper supplies make for proper learning." But not everyone shared their enthusiasm. When Eleanor rode into Calico Ridge for supplies the following day, she noticed how conversations hushed as she passed. Outside the mercantile, she overheard 2 women whispering, "Widow Harrow's schooling savages now," one said, shaking her head. "What's next? Having them to tea." "Judge Haskell says she's standing in the way of progress," the other replied. "Says that school of hers is just stirring up trouble." Eleanor held her head high and continued about her business. At the feed store, Mr. Peterson wouldn't meet her eyes as he measured out her order. The seamstress who'd always welcomed her warmly now claimed to be too busy for conversation. Haskell's influence ran deep. Eleanor saw his handiwork in the way storekeepers grew cold, in the suspicious glances from people who'd once called her friend. The judge had been busy, turning the town against her one whispered word at a time. Sunday morning dawned clear and cool. Eleanor dressed carefully in her best black dress, pinned her grey hair neatly, and drove her surrey to the white-painted church on the hill. The morning service was well attended, the wooden pews filled with familiar faces that now turned away from her searching gaze. Reverend Matthews preached about mercy and justice, his voice rising and falling as he quoted scripture. "Blessed are the peacemakers," he said, looking directly at Eleanor, "for they shall be called the children of God." After the final hymn, the congregation filed out. Women who'd once chatted with Eleanor hurried past. Men tipped their hats but kept their distance. Only Reverend Matthews stepped forward to shake her hand. "Godspeed, Mrs. Harrow," he said warmly, pressing something into her palm as he clasped her hand. "Keep faith." Back in her surrey, Eleanor opened the envelope the pastor had slipped her. Inside were several papers, water rights maps and land documents, their edges worn and creased. Her hands trembled as she read. The maps showed how Haskell had manipulated water claims, redrawing boundaries to cut off tribal access to critical springs. The documents revealed a pattern of forged signatures and altered dates, all designed to steal land from both settlers and Apache alike. These papers were dynamite. They could expose Haskell's schemes, protect the school land, and restore water rights to those who'd lost them. But having them also put her in danger. Men who would forge documents wouldn't hesitate to silence those who discovered their crimes. The drive home gave Eleanor time to think. The setting sun painted the mountains gold as her surrey climbed the familiar trail to her ranch. She could hear children's voices carrying on the evening air, Naliné teaching a final lesson before sending them home for supper. Cord looked up from his work as Eleanor climbed down from the surrey. He must have read something in her expression, because he set down his tools and came to help her with the horse. "Rough day in town?" he asked quietly. Rough in some ways, hopeful in others. Eleanor patted her pocket where the documents lay hidden. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, Mr. Gideon. Sometimes he hands you exactly what you need, right when you need it most." The sound of children's laughter floated across the yard as Naliné dismissed her pupils. 2 Apache boys raced past, followed by a settler's daughter calling out a cheerful goodbye in carefully practiced Apache words. Their easy friendship gave Eleanor courage. This was what they were building. Not just a schoolhouse, but a bridge between worlds. These children didn't see the boundaries adults drew on maps. They didn't care about railroad claims or water rights. They simply saw each other as friends, learning and growing together. Eleanor squared her shoulders, feeling the weight of the documents in her pocket. Sometimes the path of mercy required courage. Sometimes it required fighting for what was right. Eleanor waited until the ranch had settled into nighttime silence before retrieving the documents from her dresser. The lamp cast a warm glow across her kitchen table as she spread out the maps and papers. Cord sat across from her, his massive frame making the wooden chair seem small. "Look here," Eleanor said, pointing to the water rights markings. "The pastor gave me these today. Judge Haskell's been changing the boundaries, cutting off water access." Cord leaned forward, his weathered fingers tracing the altered lines. His jaw tightened as he studied each map. "These springs here," he said, tapping a spot near the proposed rail line. "That's sacred ground to the Apache. There's a family buried there." Eleanor's hand went to her throat. "Are you certain?" "Yes, Mom." Cord's voice grew rough. "I was there, winter of '68. Found them frozen after a blizzard drove them from their hunting grounds. Mother, father, 3 little ones." He closed his eyes for a moment. "We gave them a proper burial, marked it with stones. Now Haskell's claiming that land for his rail line." The lamp flickered as a night breeze slipped through the window. Eleanor watched Cord's face, seeing the old pain etched there. "These documents could stop him," she said quietly. "But they'll need someone to verify the burial site, someone who was there." Cord pushed back from the table and stood, his shadow large against the wall. "You're asking me to testify." "I'm asking you to help protect what's right. The school, the water rights, the sacred grounds, all of it." He paced to the kitchen floor, boots striking the wooden planks. "Speaking up means telling everything. The war years, the raids, why I deserted." His hands clenched. "Some things are better left buried, Mrs. Harrow. And some things need to see the light of day before healing can begin," Eleanor replied. She gathered the documents carefully. "I won't press you. Pray on it, Mr. Gideon. The Lord will guide your heart." Cord nodded once and stepped out into the night. The screen door closed softly behind him. Eleanor watched through the window as he walked toward the half-finished schoolhouse, his figure dark against the starlit sky. The night air carried the scent of pine as Cord entered the schoolhouse frame. Moonlight filtered through the open rafters, illuminating his workspace. He found his tools by touch: the plane, the chisel, the mallet he'd been using to shape the crossbeam that would span the entrance. Hour after hour, he worked in silence. The steady rhythm of carving helped still his troubled thoughts. This beam would support the weight of the roof, shelter the children below. His hands moved with certainty, shaping the wood, making it strong. As he worked, memories surfaced like shadows: the thunder of cavalry horses, snow-covered graves, a young Apache girl, Naline, watching her village burn. He'd tried to stop it, disobeyed orders, but too late. The guilt had driven him to desert, led to his imprisonment. Now here he was, building a schoolhouse where Apache and settler children would learn together, where Naline taught with quiet dignity, refusing to let bitterness poison her heart, where Eleanor Harrow believed that mercy could bridge the deepest divides. The eastern sky began to lighten. Cord set down his tools and ran his hand along the finished crossbeam. The wood was smooth under his calloused fingers, ready to bear its burden. Like truth, he thought. Heavy to carry, but necessary for things to stand. Dawn painted the mountains rose gold as he walked back to the main house. Eleanor was already up, settling kindling in the stove. She looked up as he entered, but didn't speak. Cord cleared his throat. "I've been thinking on what you asked." Eleanor straightened, watching him with steady eyes. "Those graves deserve protecting," he said. "The children deserve their school. And the truth—" He drew a deep breath. "The truth deserves telling, no matter the cost." "You'll testify then?" "Yes, ma'am, I'll speak." Eleanor's face softened with understanding. She knew what this decision meant, how it would expose his past, reopen old wounds, make him face what he'd tried to forget. But she also saw the peace in his expression, like a man who'd set down a heavy load. "Thank you, Mr. Gideon," she said simply. "Would you like some coffee?" "Much obliged," he replied, taking his usual seat at the table. Through the window, the rising sun caught the new crossbeam he'd carved, making the wood glow golden. Soon children's voices would fill the schoolhouse, their laughter echoing under that beam. Some burdens, Cord realized, were worth carrying if they helped build something true. Scene 1. The September morning dawned crisp and clear, painting the newly finished schoolhouse in golden light. Fresh-cut pine boards gleamed against the backdrop of mountain peaks, and morning glories climbed the porch posts Eleanor had planted weeks before. A brass bell hung proud above the entrance, waiting for its first ring. Children began arriving in 2s and 3s, their footsteps crunching on the gravel path. Settler families came in wagons, while Apache families arrived on horseback. The little ones clutched slate boards and cloth lunch sacks, eyeing each other with a mix of curiosity and caution. Their parents gathered in separate groups, exchanging uncertain glances across the schoolyard. Cord stood by the door, his tall frame casting a long shadow. He'd traded his usual work clothes for a clean shirt and vest, though he still gripped his oak walking staff, more from habit than need. His eyes scanned the growing crowd, noting both friendly faces and scowls among the adults. Eleanor emerged from the schoolhouse wearing her best black dress, her silver hair neat beneath a lace cap. She nodded warmly to each family, her smile genuine and steady. Behind her, Naline arranged books on the shelves, her dark hair braided with leather ties, wearing a crisp cotton dress over traditional moccasins. "Welcome, everyone," Eleanor called out, her voice carrying across the yard. "We're blessed to see you all here this morning." She turned to Naline, who joined her on the porch with quiet grace. The children shuffled closer, forming a loose circle. Some of the younger ones whispered and pointed at the colorful drawings Naline had posted in the windows, Apache symbols alongside English letters. "Before we begin," Eleanor continued, "Miss Naline will lead us in prayer, honoring both our traditions." A murmur rose from several settler families. The Hendersons turned away, leading their 2 boys back to their wagon. The Whitakers followed, Mr. Whitaker muttering loudly about proper Christian schooling. Eleanor's face showed a flicker of sadness, but she kept her composure. Cord's grip tightened on his staff, but he remained still, watching the remaining families draw closer together. Nalini stepped forward, her voice clear and strong. "Creator above, we thank you for this day." She repeated the words in Apache, the musical sounds floating on the morning air. "Bless these children as they learn together. Help them grow in wisdom and understanding." The prayer continued in both languages, weaving together like branches of the same tree. Some of the Apache children whispered the familiar words, while settler children listened with wide eyes. Their parents stood straighter, caught perhaps by the simple dignity of the moment. Eleanor moved to the bell rope. "Now, children, shall we begin our first day with a song?" She pulled the rope, and the bell rang out across the valley, clear, bright, and full of promise. "Amazing grace, if you please." Nalini started the familiar hymn, her voice joined first by Eleanor, then by the children. Slowly, hesitantly at first, the ancient melody rose from different tongues. Apache voices blended with English ones, creating something new and beautiful in the mountain air. The children filed into the schoolhouse, taking seats on smooth pine benches. Sunlight streamed through the windows, catching the dust motes that danced in the air. Eleanor wrote "Welcome" on the new slate board, while Nalini began teaching the children to say good morning in both languages. Cord watched from his post by the door as the last parents departed. Some nodded to him, others hurried past. But inside, 20 children sat together, already sharing slate pencils and curious glances. Their small voices rose and fell like music, stumbling over new words, giggling at mispronunciations, helping each other sound out strange syllables. The day passed in a blur of lessons, laughter, and small victories. When the last child had gone home, Eleanor sat on the porch steps, watching the sunset paint the mountains purple. Cord joined her, his staff resting against the rail. "Thank you, Mr. Gideon," she said softly, for believing this was possible. Cord was quiet for a long moment, listening to the evening wind in the pines. "Truth is, Mrs. Harrow, I haven't believed in much of anything for a long time." He looked at the schoolhouse, solid and real in the fading light. "But this feels like something worth guarding." Eleanor nodded, understanding all he left unsaid. Above them, the bell caught the last rays of sun, gleaming like hope made metal. Inside, Nalini could be heard humming as she straightened books and tidied slates, preparing for tomorrow's lessons. The schoolhouse stood as they'd built it, a shelter for learning, a bridge between worlds, a testament to what faith and hard work could raise from bare earth. Not everyone would accept it, but for those who did, it offered something precious, a place where children could grow together, where old wounds might begin to heal, where amazing grace could be sung in many voices. 3 nights after the schoolhouse opened its doors, Cord sat on the bunkhouse porch, cleaning his tools by lantern light. The autumn evening had grown cold, stars pricking through the darkening sky like ice crystals. A whiff of smoke caught his attention, not wood smoke from chimneys, but something sharper, more urgent. He stood, scanning the ridge. An orange glow flickered where the schoolhouse stood. His heart stopped. "Fire!" he bellowed, already running. Nalini emerged from the main house, her shawl flying behind her as she raced to keep up. They crested the hill together, breathless, only to find the schoolhouse engulfed in flames. The heat hit them like a wall. "No," Nalini whispered, her voice breaking. "No, no, no." 3 mounted figures galloped away toward town, their shadows merging with the night. The fire roared higher, consuming the fresh-cut pine walls, the books, the slates, everything they'd built with such care. Through the flames, Cord glimpsed Eleanor's piano, its keys melting like black and white tears. Nalini ran to the well, but Cord caught her arm. "Too late," he said hoarsely. "It's too far gone." They could only watch as the roof collapsed inward, sending a shower of sparks toward heaven. The brass bell gave one last mournful toll, before crashing down into the inferno. Eleanor arrived in her nightdress and shawl, her face ghost-white in the firelight. She stumbled forward, and Cord steadied her with gentle hands. "My God!" she breathed. "All those children's hopes!" As the flames died down, they found a crude wooden cross lying in the ashes, its surface scorched black. Eleanor picked it up with trembling fingers, then sank to her knees in the dirt. "Mrs. Harrow," Naliné said softly, kneeling beside her. "Please come inside. You'll catch your death out here." But Eleanor didn't move, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She looked smaller somehow, more fragile, as if the fire had burned away something vital inside her. Sheriff Thorne arrived near dawn, when the ruins were still smoking. He kicked at the ashes, wrote in his notebook, and shook his head. "No witnesses," he said. "Not much I can do." "You know who did this," Cord growled. "Haskell's men." The sheriff wouldn't meet his eyes. "That's a serious accusation, Gideon. Best be careful with those." The morning sun rose red through the smoke haze. Eleanor sat in her kitchen, staring at nothing, while Naliné tried to coax her to drink some tea. The crunch of wagon wheels made them all look up. Judge Varner Haskell stepped down from his carriage, immaculate in his black suit. He surveyed the destruction with obvious satisfaction. "Terrible business," he said, removing his hat. "But perhaps a blessing in disguise, Mrs. Harrow. Progress can't be stopped, best to accept it gracefully." He smiled, showing too many teeth. "I'm still willing to make a generous offer for your land." Something snapped inside Cord. Before anyone could move, his fist connected with Haskell's jaw, sending the judge sprawling in the dirt. Blood trickled from his split lip. "Sheriff!" Haskell roared. "Arrest this man! He's the one who led the Ghost Creek massacre. I have witnesses!" "That's a lie!" Cord snarled, but deputies were already grabbing his arms. "I refused those orders. I was in prison because I wouldn't—" "Take him in," Sheriff Thorne ordered, not looking at Eleanor's stricken face. They dragged Cord toward the wagon. Eleanor rushed forward, her voice rising. "Sheriff, please! He's innocent! I have proof of what really happened! The documents!" Her words cut off in a gasp. She pressed one hand to her chest, the other reaching blindly for support. Her legs buckled, and she collapsed onto the wooden boardwalk. "Eleanor!" Naliné cried, running to catch her. The widow lay still, her face ashen, breath coming in shallow pants. Cord fought against the deputy's grip, desperate to reach her. "Get him to jail," Thorne barked. "Someone fetch Doc Miller." The last thing Cord saw as they drove him away was Naliné cradling Eleanor's head in her lap, tears streaming down her face as she prayed in whispered Apache. Behind them, smoke still rose from the schoolhouse ruins, a black column against the blood-red sunrise. Eleanor drifted in and out of consciousness, her breath shallow and weak. Doc Miller visited twice daily, shaking his head at her pale complexion. Naliné rarely left her side, cooling her forehead with damp cloths and singing soft Apache healing songs. "The fever's breaking," Doc Miller announced on the third morning. "But her heart's weak. She needs absolute rest." Through the window, they could hear townsfolk arguing in the street. Some defended Eleanor's school, while others praised Haskell's progress. The sound of hammering carried from the ridge, railroad surveyors marking their claims. Naliné knew the children weren't safe. That afternoon, she led them deep into the Pignon forest where her people had hidden for generations. "These caves kept us alive during hard winters," she explained, showing them natural shelters beneath overhanging rocks. "Now they'll protect you until we make things right." The settler children looked nervous, but young Sarah Cooper spoke up. "Ma says what they did to Miss Eleanor and Mr. Gideon ain't Christian." "Your mother speaks truth," Naliné replied, arranging blankets in the shelter. She taught them to gather piñon nuts and find clean water, just as her grandmother had taught her. In the evenings, they practiced their lessons by firelight, whispering multiplication tables and Bible verses. Back in town, 9-year-old Chuli watched everything with silent intensity. Though he never spoke, his dark eyes missed nothing. Every day he visited the jail, sitting cross-legged outside Cord's window. Sometimes he carved small figures from pine wood, mimicking Cord's technique. One morning, Julie appeared in Sheriff Thorne's office clutching Cord's carved staff, the one he'd used to teach the children proper posture. The boy's face was painted with white clay, marking him for serious business. Behind him stood 12 settler children, their own faces streaked with clay in a patchy fashion. Sheriff Thorne looked up from his desk, startled. "What's all this?" The children said nothing. They simply stood, shoulder to shoulder, staring at him with solemn eyes. Through the window, more townspeople gathered to watch. "Now see here," Thorne began, but his voice faltered. Julie stepped forward and placed Cord's staff on the desk. Carved into its length was a story. Children of two peoples learning together, a bell ringing over mountains, a man laying down his weapons to build instead of destroy. Minutes stretched into hours. The children didn't move. More townsfolk pressed against the windows. Whispers spread. "Them's the Cooper kids, and the blacksmith's boys, standing with Apache children. Ain't natural," someone muttered. "Ain't natural to burn schools neither," came the reply. By noon, mothers began arriving with food and water for the children. Even Mrs. Cooper, who'd once crossed the street to avoid Indians, knelt to share her bread with Julie. The boy accepted with grave courtesy, breaking it carefully to share with the others. Back at Harrow's mercy, Eleanor stirred from her fevered dreams. "Charles," she whispered, reaching for someone only she could see. "Charles, where is your chest? The journal ... "What chest, Mrs. Harrow?" Naliné asked gently. "My husband's, from the war, in the attic." Eleanor's voice strengthened. "Please, bring it to me." Naliné found the battered cavalry chest under the attic eaves. Its brass fittings were green with age, but the lock still held. Eleanor's trembling fingers worked the key. Inside lay Captain Charles Harrow's field journal, its pages yellow and brittle. Eleanor turned them carefully, her eyes clearing as she read. "Here," she said finally. The Ghost Creek engagement. Charles was there as chaplain. He wrote everything down. Naliné leaned closer. The spidery handwriting told a dark tale. Haskell, then a junior officer, had ordered the massacre of peaceful families. Cord Gideon had refused, trying to warn the camp. For that, he'd faced court-martial while Haskell claimed credit for a victory. "My Charles testified for Cord," Eleanor whispered, "but Haskell had him transferred before the trial. The truth never came out." Her hand shook as she touched the pages. Until now. A commotion rose from town, voices calling, boots on boardwalks. Naliné helped Eleanor to the window. Through the autumn haze, they saw a strange procession. Children leading their parents towards the jail, Julie out front with Cord's staff held high like a banner. "The children," Eleanor breathed. "They've chosen justice over fear." Tears spilled down her cheeks. Perhaps that's what we needed all along. She clutched the journal to her chest, strength flowing back into her voice. "Help me dress, dear. We have evidence to deliver." "You're not strong enough," Naliné protested. "The Lord will provide strength," Eleanor replied, her eyes bright with purpose. "And these children have shown us the way." The town hall's wooden benches creaked under the weight of every soul in Calico Ridge. Dust motes danced in shafts of morning light, streaming through tall windows. Judge Harrison Peters, brought in from Denver, adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles and called the makeshift court to order. Cord stood straight-backed in his prison clothes, hands unbound but shoulders tense. His eyes swept the crowd, settling briefly on the empty seat where Eleanor should have been. Varner Haskell rose in his fine black coat, a stack of yellowed papers in his manicured hands. "Your Honor, I present evidence that the accused, Cord Gideon, led an unauthorized attack on peaceful Apache camps in 1872. 43 souls lost, including women and children." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Haskell's voice dripped with false piety as he described battlefield horrors, all blamed on Cord. The heavy doors groaned open, Eleanor Harrow stood in the entrance, leaning on Naline's arm. Her face was pale as paper, but her spine was steel straight. In her free hand, she clutched a leather-bound journal. "Your Honor," she called out, her voice carrying clear across the hushed room. "I have evidence that must be heard." She made her way slowly to the front, each step measured and careful. "This is the field journal of my late husband, Captain Charles Harrow, chaplain of the 7th Cavalry. His words tell a different tale." Judge Peters accepted the journal, turning its brittle pages with care. Eleanor's voice strengthened as she read aloud. "Lieutenant Haskell ordered the burning of civilian camps against direct command. Scout Gideon refused and tried warning the Apache families. For this act of conscience, he faced court-martial while Haskell claimed victory." Haskell's face reddened. "Lies! That woman is delusional with grief." "I am not finished," Eleanor said firmly. She nodded to Naline, who stepped forward. "I remember that night," Naline said, her voice steady. "I was 12 years old. This man," she pointed at Cord, "led my brother and me to safety while others set fire to our homes. He chose mercy when mercy was forbidden." The courtroom fell silent as a grave. Judge Peters studied the journal entries, comparing dates and orders. Haskell began edging toward the door, but 2 deputies blocked his path. "The court finds insufficient evidence to hold Mr. Gideon," the judge announced. "Case dismissed." He turned steely eyes on Haskell. "However, these documents raise serious questions about land deed authenticity. Sheriff, detain Mr. Haskell for further investigation." As Haskell was led away in irons, word arrived by telegraph. Federal marshals had found a cache of forged land deeds in his Denver office. Justice, slow but certain, had finally arrived in Calico Ridge. The autumn air crackled with purpose as wagons rolled up to Eleanor's Highland Ranch. Settlers and Apache families arrived together, carrying tools and supplies. Children darted between adults, passing wooden planks hand to hand in a living chain. Cord stood at the center of the burned foundation, marking fresh timber with his carpenter's pencil. His voice, usually so guarded, rang clear with direction. "Mind those joints now. We're building this one to last." Naline moved among the workers, offering water from clay jars and teaching the children to weave friendship bracelets while they waited to help. Her dark eyes met Cord's occasionally, sharing quiet understanding. The past couldn't be undone, but the future could be shaped by willing hands. Eleanor sat wrapped in a patchwork quilt near the fence line, her face glowing despite her weakness. She watched as Apache mothers laid out fry bread and settler wives set up tables of stew and cornbread. The meal was shared without ceremony or separation. "Look how far we've come," she murmured to Naline, who paused to adjust the quilt around Eleanor's shoulders. "From suspicion to breaking bread together." The walls rose steadily over 3 weeks. Cord showed young Apache men how to notch logs for corners while learning their traditional methods for securing roof beams. The structure grew stronger than before, incorporating both ways of building. Naline spent evenings decorating the interior walls with woven symbols of peace and learning. She taught the meaning of each design to curious settler children who helped her hang them. The circle of knowledge, the flowing river of wisdom, the rising sun of new beginnings. When the first snow clouds gathered, only the bell remained to be hung. Cord presented a surprise. He had taken his old prison manacles to the blacksmith, who melted them down with salvaged iron from the burned schoolhouse. Together, they cast a new bell that carried the weight of the past transformed into hope. On mounting day, little Chuli stepped forward. The mute boy who had led the children's protest now stood straight and proud. Cord lifted him up to the bell rope, and small hands gripped with determination. The clear tone rang out across the valley, echoing off the frosted hills. Chuli's face split in a rare smile as children cheered. Snow began to fall softly, dusting the fresh-cut timber and newly thatched roof. Eleanor's eyes glistened as she watched from her chair. The schoolhouse stood renewed, not just rebuilt, a testament to what mercy could achieve. Settler and Apache children crowded the doorway together, eager to begin learning in this space that belonged to all of them. Spring crept into the valley like a gentle awakening. The highland meadows around Eleanor's ranch shed their winter browns for tender green shoots. Morning frost gave way to dew drops that sparkled on new grass, and the schoolhouse windows stood open to welcome the fresh mountain air. Eleanor sat at her desk near the east-facing window, her pen scratching steadily across cream-colored paper. Stacks of addressed envelopes waited nearby, bound for places like Durango, Santa Fe, and a dozen other frontier towns where the seeds of change might take root. The morning light caught the silver in her hair as she wrote about what they'd built here. Not just a schoolhouse, but a bridge between peoples. "The children learn together," she wrote, her careful script flowing across the page. "They share stories in 2 languages, sing hymns that blend like tributary streams, and their laughter knows no borders. What seemed impossible last autumn now feels as natural as breathing." Outside, the schoolyard buzzed with activity. Children played games that mixed settler rules with Apache traditions, their voices rising in both English and Apache words. Naline moved among them during their noon break, her dark hair catching the sunlight as she showed a group how to weave grass into simple baskets. Eleanor paused in her writing to watch Cord approach the schoolyard. He carried wooden markers he'd carved himself, heading toward the grove where he'd planted a young blue spruce. The tree stood as a living memorial to the Apache family whose grave he'd once concealed, their truth now honored in the light rather than hidden in shadow. Cord worked with quiet purpose, setting the wooden plaque he'd made. The carved words were simple but clear: "Sacred ground in memory of the brave." Eleanor noticed how his hands, once so destructive in war, now moved with gentle reverence as he arranged river stones around the base of the young tree. Naline saw him too. She excused herself from the children and walked toward the grove, carrying something close to her heart. Eleanor recognized the beaded medicine pouch that had belonged to Naline's brother, a precious memory of family lost too soon. From her window, Eleanor watched the 2 of them by the memorial tree. There was a different quality to their silence now. She noticed. The tension that had marked their early encounters had softened into something else, something that made them stand closer together, that gentled their gestures toward each other. Naline knelt to tie her brother's medicine pouch to a low branch, her movements ceremonial and precise. Cord stood respectfully still, but his eyes never left her face. When she rose, their hands found each other without hurry or hesitation. They stood together before the memorial, their fingers intertwined, sharing the kind of quiet that comes after long storms have passed. Eleanor smiled to herself, remembering other loves that had bloomed in unlikely soil. She turned back to her letters, giving them their privacy, but her heart felt full. Love had a way of healing what justice alone could not touch. Later that afternoon, as shadows lengthened across the schoolyard, Eleanor watched Cord and Naline take one of their now familiar walks along the creek path. They moved in step with each other, pausing to examine early wildflowers or listen to returning meadowlarks. Sometimes they talked, their words too distant to hear, but often they simply walked in companionable silence. Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she sealed another envelope. Age and her weak heart were catching up with her, but seeing love and learning flourish around her gave her strength. The schoolhouse bell rang clear in the afternoon air, calling children back to their lessons. She watched them file in, Apache and settler children side by side, carrying books and slates, their futures as bright as the spring sky. A fresh breeze carried the scent of pine and possibility through her window. Eleanor dipped her pen once more, beginning another letter to another distant town. "Come see what mercy can build," she wrote. "Come see how love can transform a valley, and how children can teach us all to be better than we were." In the grove, the memorial tree's new leaves danced in the wind. The medicine pouch swayed gently from its branch, its beads catching the light like drops of colored rain. Below, the wooden plaque stood as testament to truth spoken and honor restored. Eleanor looked out at what they'd all built together, not just structures of wood and stone, but bridges of understanding that would last beyond her time. The schoolhouse gleamed in the early morning light of Resurrection Sunday, its weathered boards freshly swept and windows sparkling. Spring flowers dotted the meadow, and the memorial spruce had grown tall enough to cast dappled shadows across the yard. Inside, rough-hewn benches lined the room where desks usually stood, transformed for today's special service. Eleanor sat in the front row, her silver hair arranged neatly beneath a modest black hat. In her arms, wrapped in a soft blanket, woven with Apache symbols of blessing, lay a tiny bundle, Cord and Naline's newborn son. His dark eyes, so like his mother's, blinked up at Eleanor as she gently rocked him. The baby's small hand curled around her finger with surprising strength. The schoolhouse bell rang out across the valley, its clear tone calling families to worship. They came in twos and threes along the well-worn paths, settler families in their Sunday best, Apache mothers with children in bright shawls, mestizo ranchers with weathered faces and careful manners. The sound of boots and moccasins on wooden steps filled the air as they filed in, nodding greetings to one another. Cord stood at the door, tall and straight in a clean black coat. His face had softened over the past year, the hard lines of his past smoothed by love and purpose. He helped elderly Mrs. Martinez up the steps, then reached back to steady a group of Apache elders who had traveled from the reservation. His eyes constantly sought Naline, who moved among the arriving families with natural grace, helping mothers settle children and exchanging quiet words of welcome. The morning sun streamed through the east windows, catching the dust motes in bars of gold. Eleanor watched as more families arrived than the schoolhouse had ever held. They squeezed onto benches, stood along the walls, and spilled out onto the porch. Children sat cross-legged in the aisles, their faces bright with excitement. When the last bell tone faded, Cord made his way to where Eleanor sat. He knelt beside her bench, his large hands gentle as he touched his son's cheek. The baby cooed, and something in Cord's expression made Eleanor's heart swell with joy. "Miss Eleanor," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion, "I need to thank you for everything, for that day at the auction, for believing when no one else would." He swallowed hard. "For showing mercy to a man who didn't deserve it." Eleanor shifted the baby in her arms and reached out to touch Cord's weathered face. "You were never my punishment, Cord," she said, her voice clear and strong despite her years. "You were the answer to my prayer. I asked God to send me someone who could help build something lasting here, not just a school, but hope." She smiled, glancing at the baby. "And look what he built instead. A family. A future." Naline joined them then, settling beside Cord. She wore a dress that blended frontier style with Apache design, and her dark hair was braided with silver beads that had been her mother's. Eleanor carefully passed the baby to his parents, watching as they cradled him together. Outside, through the open windows, came the sound of children's laughter. Several young ones chased spring lambs under the blooming apple trees Eleanor had planted the previous year. Their voices carried no trace of the divisions that had once seemed insurmountable. They played together as naturally as siblings. The pastor rose to begin the service, but paused to look out over the gathered congregation. Eleanor followed his gaze, seeing what he saw: Apache grandmothers sharing hymn books with settler wives, ranch hands and tribal men nodding in respectful greeting, children of all backgrounds sitting shoulder to shoulder on the floor. This was what the West could be, what it should be. The baby made a small sound, and Eleanor watched as Naline hummed a soft Apache lullaby while Cord's large hand cradled their son's head. The morning light touched them like a blessing, and Eleanor felt tears in her eyes, not of sorrow, but of profound gratitude. As the congregation began to sing, their voices rising in harmony that blended English and Apache words, Eleanor saw faces at the windows. Travelers had stopped on the road, drawn by the unusual sight and sound. Word had spread about the school, about the widow who built bridges instead of walls, about the warrior who chose peace, about the love that grew from ashes of the past. The West was watching, and in this small valley, they could see what was possible when mercy triumphed over fear, when love overcame hatred, when people chose to build something new together. Thank you for watching. If this one reached you, consider subscribing. I'll be back tomorrow with more meaning, more humanity.